For about a decade, they were the biggest band on the planet. I mean, they were everything, and then, poof, they were gone. Now, we all think we know the story of the Beatles' breakup, but what if I told you that while the band was literally tearing itself apart from the inside, on the other side of the world, they were seen as a threat so powerful it could actually bring down a nation? Let's get into the story of how the world's biggest band collapsed and how, at the very same time, they became the enemy in a full-blown cultural war.
So, listen to this. These were the last public words John Lennon ever spoke as a Beatle. It's January 30th, 1969. The band just wrapped up this surprise performance, and with that classic sarcastic Lennon wit, an entire era just quietly ended. So, how did they get to this point?
And the scene for that final goodbye? The rooftop of their own headquarters, Apple Corps, in London. Imagine this. After 885 days, that's almost 2.5 years, without playing a single live gig, they just step out into the freezing cold and play a 42-minute set for anyone on the street lucky enough to look up. It was legendary, totally spontaneous, and it was their very last concert. Ever.
Which brings us to the big question, right? They were the Beatles. They had completely redefined music, culture, fame itself. So what on earth could possibly be strong enough to break up the most influential band of the 20th century? Well, the answer, it's not simple.
You see, the breakup wasn't one big explosion. It was more like a slow, painful crack spreading over time. And the first major blow, the one that really set them adrift, didn't happen in a recording studio. It started with a huge personal tragedy.
It was like a domino effect. It really started in '66 when they quit touring, because they were just completely burned out by Beatlemania. But the real turning point, the moment everything changed, was August 1967. Their manager, Brian Epstein, the guy who was basically the glue holding them together, he died suddenly. And his death just left them totally lost, scared, and without anyone to referee their growing fights.
So into that leadership vacuum, Paul McCartney steps up. You know, he tried to steer the ship, getting projects like Get Back off the ground to keep them busy, but the other guys saw it differently. They started to feel like his attempts to help were actually turning into him dominating everything, and that just brewed a lot of resentment where there used to be a real partnership.
And you could literally hear the cracks forming in their music. Take their 1968 double album, The White Album. It's been called 4 solo albums, all stuck under one roof. Even John Lennon himself said you can hear the sound of the Beatles breaking up right there in the grooves of that record. They were in the same room, sure, but creatively, they were worlds apart.
So in those final years, all that friction just escalated into full-blown fractures. Their personal lives, their individual ambitions, and huge disagreements over business made working together pretty much impossible.
And this wasn't some clean, quick break. It was a slow, agonizing process. It really happened in stages. First, Ringo actually quit for a bit in August of '68. Then George did the same thing in January of '69. But the final blow came that September, when John privately told the band he wanted a divorce. It was still another 7 months before Paul's public announcement made it official for the whole world.
For decades, Paul McCartney really got the blame for the split, just because his announcement was the one that went public. But in 2021, he finally set the record straight. The quote you're looking at is in Indonesian, and it translates to his words, "I didn't cause the split." That person was Arjani. He made it crystal clear that from his point of view, it was John Lennon's decision to leave that was the real beginning of the end.
And if there was a point of no return, this was it. The other 3 Beatles voted to hire this notoriously tough businessman, Alan Klein, to handle their money. Paul wanted his father-in-law, Lee Eastman. Well, Paul was outvoted, and that business decision basically drew the battle lines and shattered any trust that was left.
Okay, so that's the story we all kind of know, right? A story of arguments, creative differences, money problems. But this is where our explainer takes a really sharp turn. Because while the 4 of them were watching their partnership dissolve, at least one world leader was seeing something totally different. A direct threat to his entire nation.
All right, let's jump over to 1960s Indonesia, under President Sukarno. Over there, the Beatles weren't seen as these charming, talented musicians. No, they were seen as the face of a dangerous cultural invasion.
Sukarno even had a special name for the music he hated, Nak Ngik Ngok. It was this dismissive, made-up word meant to sound like just meaningless noise. That was his label for all Western pop and rock. To him, it was just crazy, cheap nonsense. And in his eyes, the Beatles were the kings of Nak Ngik Ngok.
His government built an entire case against them.
And this wasn't just about musical taste. The Beatles were officially accused of being a weapon of Western imperialism, a threat to the Indonesian identity. Their music was called crazy music that had to be wiped out. They were named the #1 cause of juvenile delinquency and were even blamed for robbery, theft, and sexual harassment. Some people even claimed they were a secret communist plot to corrupt the youth.
And the government's crackdown was no joke. Local bands that dared to sound like them, like Koz Bersaudara, were actually thrown in jail. Their records were seized from stores and smashed. Police conducted raids, not for drugs, but for long, Beatles-style hair, which they would forcibly cut on the spot. They went after fans wearing tight pants, slashing them right then and there. And of course, their songs were completely banned from the radio.
So let's bring these two stories together for a second. At the exact moment the Beatles were at their most broken and fragile as a band, their power as a symbol out in the world had never, ever been greater.
And that leads us to this just incredible paradox at the heart of the whole story. On the inside, it was just four guys who couldn't stand to be in the same room anymore. But on the outside, they were seen as this massive, unified cultural weapon, powerful enough to threaten an entire country's identity. It's just a wild reminder of the gap between the artists and the art, between reality and how people see you.
And that really leaves us with something to think about, doesn't it? It shows the strange, almost magical power that music has. It can be so deeply personal that it drives lifelong friends apart. And at the exact same time, it can become a global symbol so huge that governments feel like they have to literally declare war on it. It just proves that sometimes a simple song really can shake the entire world.